I let a stranger press his body against mine in the dark of a Los Angeles warehouse while Silas was only 50 feet away, searching for our missing friends. The air in the arts district was thick with the kind of heat that only 1,000 moving bodies can generate, and the strobe lights were slicing the room into jagged fragments of reality. We had been standing at the very front, near the speaker stacks, where the bass felt like a physical weight against the chest. Silas was behind me, his hands resting lightly on my waist in a way that usually made me feel like the most protected woman in the city. He is the kind of man who trusts without a contract and loves without a cage. He never questioned what I wore or who I spoke to, because he believed that our connection was something solid and immovable. But that night, the foundations of that belief were starting to crack under the pressure of the music and the substances humming through our veins. We were there to see a friend play a set that was supposed to be the highlight of our month. The music was a relentless mechanical pulse that dictated the movement of every person in that room. I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere before I saw the cause of it. A man who looked like he belonged on a billboard in West Hollywood, rather than a sweaty warehouse party, pushed his way through the crowd with a level of entitlement that was almost breathtaking. He did not navigate the space, he commanded it. He stepped directly between Silas and me, forced his way into the small gap that should have been sacred, and immediately made his presence felt. His hands were on my hips before I could even process his face, and he began to move with a rhythm that was invasive and deliberate. I am not the kind of woman who expects this level of attention. In a city like Los Angeles, where everyone is a professional beauty, I have always considered myself a quiet background character, a 6 out of 10 on a generous day. Seeing a man who looked like he walked off a high-fashion set risk a confrontation with my boyfriend just to get close to me felt like a surreal glitch in the Matrix. It was a display of social dominance that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Silas reacted with his usual calm strength. He did not descend into a primal rage, because he is not that kind of man. He simply reached through the noise and the heat, pulled me toward him, and led me to the other side of the dance floor. We brushed it off as the typical chaos of a Friday night in the city. We were both under the influence of the evening, and the logic of the day had been replaced by the fluid morality of the night. 20 minutes later, the music shifted into something deeper and more primal. Silas leaned into my ear, his voice a ghost of a sound against the roar of the speakers. He told me he needed to find our friends, who had wandered off toward the back of the venue. He was worried about their state of mind and wanted to make sure everyone was safe before the set ended. He told me to stay exactly where I was by the speaker stack and promised he would return in minutes. I told him I would wait, and I watched his silhouette disappear into the sea of shadows. I felt a sudden coldness as his warmth left me, but I remained rooted to the spot as I had promised. It took less than 200 seconds for the man to return. It was as if he had been watching from the periphery, waiting for the exact moment the guardian of my conscience turned his back. I saw him weaving through the crowd, his eyes locked on mine with a predatory focus that made my breath hitch. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me before he even spoke, because I realized in that moment that I had been waiting for him too. I am shy by nature, a girl who usually fades into the wallpaper, but the chemicals in my blood were turning my inhibitions into smoke. The music was a wall of sound that made traditional conversation impossible, but he leaned in so close that his lips were brushing the shell of my ear. He asked me how a man like Silas could ever manage to hold on to someone like me. He was laughing, a low and mocking sound that was designed to make Silas seem small and me seem like a prize that was being wasted. I should have turned away. I should have walked toward the exit or found my boyfriend, but the words he was using were like a drug, more potent than anything I had taken that night. He began to describe me in ways that were vulgar in their intensity, but undeniably flattering to a woman who had spent her life feeling invisible. He told me I looked like I had secrets that Silas would never understand, and that I was far more dangerous than I appeared. The problem was that I liked it. I did not like the way he spoke about the man I loved, but I liked the way his words made me feel like a different version of myself. I liked the power that came with his attention. He was a man who clearly believed he was out of my league, and yet he was focused on me with an intensity that was almost violent. When he reached out and gripped my waist again, I did not pull away. I let his hands find the skin beneath my silk top, and the sensation was like an electric current that threatened to short-circuit my moral compass. His touch was a sin against everything Silas and I had built, but in the haze of the warehouse, it felt like the only real thing in the world. He pulled me closer until there was no air left between us. I could feel the heat radiating off him, and the scent of his skin was a mixture of expensive tobacco and the cold salt of the Pacific. He was leaning in to kiss my neck, a gesture that was both a claim and an invitation to ruin. That was the moment the reality of the situation finally pierced through the fog. I saw Silas in my mind, his face full of trust and concern as he searched the warehouse for our friends. I realized that this man was not an admirer. He was a scavenger who wanted to take something that did not belong to him simply because he could. I snapped out of the trance with a force that made my head spin. I pushed him away with both hands and felt the sudden shock of the cold air hitting my skin where his hands had been. I muttered a frantic apology and turned to run before I could see the expression on his face. I carved a path through the crowd, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I felt like a traitor who had managed to escape the gallows at the last second. When I finally found Silas near the back of the room and felt his familiar arms wrap around me, I wanted to weep. He asked me if I was okay, if the music was too loud, or if I was feeling the effects of the night too strongly. I told him I was fine, but the lie felt like lead in my mouth. I had not technically cheated, but the intent had lived in my heart for those few minutes, and that felt like a betrayal that could never be erased. I looked back at the dance floor and saw the man watching us from the shadows with a smirk that told me he knew exactly what he had done. He had not just tried to touch me, he had successfully planted a seed of rot in the center of our relationship. As Silas led me out of the warehouse and into the cool air of the Los Angeles night, I knew that I could not just let this go. The guilt was a heavy weight, but underneath it, a new feeling was starting to grow. It was a cold and calculating need to make that man pay for what he had tried to take and for the way he had made me feel like a stranger in my own skin. The drive back to our apartment in Silver Lake was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Silas kept his hand on my knee the entire time, a gesture of grounding and affection that felt like a hot iron against my skin. Every time the car hit a pothole or the streetlights of the 101 freeway flickered across his face, I felt the weight of the secret I was carrying. My boyfriend is not the controlling type, and his trust in me is absolute, but that trust now felt like a heavy chain. I had not told him what happened while he was gone, and the silence was already beginning to ferment into a lie. I looked out the window at the passing city, seeing the neon signs of late-night diners and the hazy glow of the Hollywood Hills. Los Angeles is a city that thrives on hidden narratives, and I realized I had just written a new and ugly chapter for myself. I felt horrible because I knew that even though I had pushed the man away and walked away rather quickly, the psychological barrier had been breached. I knew I did not actually cheat in the physical sense, but the internal betrayal felt real, and the guilt was a living thing in my chest. When we finally got home, the apartment felt different. The familiar scent of vanilla candles and old books, which usually brought me peace, now felt like a reproach. Silas kissed my forehead and told me to get some sleep. He was still the man who trusted me implicitly, who saw me as a pillar of integrity in a world of shifting sand. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling for hours while the sun began to bleed through the blinds. My mind was a carousel of the night's events. I kept replaying the way the stranger's hands had felt on my waist, and the way his comments about how Silas even managed to pull me had managed to bypass my defenses. I was disgusted by my own reaction, and by the fact that for a few minutes, I had let a stranger dismantle the respect I had for my relationship just because I liked the attention. I asked myself if I was a horrible person, and the silence of the room offered no comfort. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the neon lights of the warehouse and felt the phantom touch of a man who had seen right through my shy exterior to the vanity hidden beneath. By noon the next day, the guilt had transformed into a cold and sharp-edged clarity. I realized that if I told Silas, it would break him. He was too good for the messy reality of what had happened at that warehouse. He lived in a world of black and white, where loyalty was a given, and I did not want to be the one to introduce him to the gray. But I also knew that I could not simply move on. The man at the rave had targeted me with a surgical precision that suggested I was not his first victim, and I certainly would not be his last. He was a social predator who used the cover of loud music and substances to humiliate men by tempting their partners. He didn't just want me, he wanted to win a game that Silas didn't even know he was playing. I decided that I would not be a casualty in his game. I would become the player, and I would ensure that his next move was his last. I started my digital reconnaissance while Silas was at the gym. The modern world leaves too many footprints for a man as arrogant as he was. I knew the name of our DJ friend, and I knew the specific venue in the arts district. It took less than an hour to find a tagged photo from the night before. There he was, in a series of blurry slides, Jackson Thorne. He was not just a random club-goer, he was a minor player in the Los Angeles nightlife scene, a guy who worked in talent management and social media branding. He had a following of 50,000 people and a curated feed that screamed of high-end luxury and calculated cool. He was the kind of man who sold an image of success while preying on the insecurities of others. His profile was a testament to his vanity, filled with shots of expensive cars and rooftop parties where everyone looked bored and beautiful. The more I scrolled, the more I saw the architecture of his life. He had a girlfriend named Clarissa, a high-end interior designer with a client list that included some of the most influential people in the city. They were the quintessential Los Angeles power couple. In every photo, they looked polished and untouchable. Jackson used Clarissa to ground his reputation, to make him seem like a man of substance while he spent his nights in the dark of warehouses trying to ruin what other people had built. I saw the comments he left on her posts and the way he performed the role of the devoted partner. It was a lie, and I was the proof. Clarissa looked like the kind of woman who had worked incredibly hard for her success, and seeing her standing next to a man who had tried to pull my skirt up in a dark warehouse made my blood run cold with anger. The anger began to replace the guilt. Jackson had stood there in the dark and mocked Silas, asking how a guy like him could pull a girl like me. He had tried to use my own vanity against my relationship. I realized that the only way to truly purge the feeling of being a victim was to strip Jackson of the one thing he valued most, his social standing and his perfect image. I did not want a physical confrontation, and I did not want a screaming match. I wanted a total and systematic dismantling of his life. I wanted him to lose the respect of his peers, the trust of his partner, and the carefully constructed mask he wore for the world. I wanted him to see that the girl he considered a 6 was the one who could bring his entire 10 out of 10 life crashing down. I spent the next 3 days creating a secondary digital identity. I used the knowledge of his vulgarity and his specific brand of flattery to build a profile that I knew he could not resist. I knew what he liked because he had told me in the dark, while the bass was rattling my teeth. I knew he liked the idea of a girl who looked like she had a hidden, kinky side and had secrets. I curated a feed that looked authentic but mysterious, using photos of cityscapes and art that hinted at a life lived in the shadows. I began to interact with his circle from the shadows, liking the right photos and appearing in the peripheries of his digital world. I was baiting a hook, and I knew he was the kind of man who could never pass up a chance to feed his own ego. It was a slow and meticulous process, but I had the patience of someone who had been deeply wronged. Silas noticed I was distant. He asked if I was still feeling the come down from the weekend, and I told him I was just stressed with work. It was the first real lie I had ever told him, and it felt like a splinter in my throat. I hated the way I had to hide from him, but I told myself it was necessary. I was protecting him from a truth that would only cause him pain, and I was preparing a gift of justice that he would never even know he received. I watched him across the dinner table, a man of quiet honor who spent his days working hard and his nights caring for me, and I felt a fierce protectiveness that I had never experienced before. Jackson Thorne thought he could play with us because he perceived us as weak. He was about to find out that the people he considered average were far more dangerous than the elites he was used to chasing. On Thursday night, I received the first direct message from him. It was simple and arrogant, exactly what I expected. He asked if we had met at the warehouse and told me I had been on his mind. He did not realize he was talking to the same girl he had tried to kiss just days before. He only saw the curated version of the mystery I had created. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I typed my response. I was no longer the shy person who didn't know what to say to an ass. I was a hunter, and I had just heard the trap snap shut. I kept my replies short and suggestive, leading him further into the web. I let him believe that he was the one doing the chasing, that he was the one in control. The conversation moved quickly. Jackson was bold and inappropriate within minutes, proving that his behavior at the rave was a pattern rather than an isolated incident. He sent messages that would have devastated Clarissa if she ever saw them. He spoke about his life as if it were a cage, and about me as if I were the key. He sent photos of himself in his office and in his car, and I saved every single one. I was building a dossier of his infidelity and his arrogance. I wanted to wait until the moment of maximum impact. I wasn't just going to send these to his girlfriend. I was going to make sure everyone who mattered to him saw who he really was. I was going to turn his digital kingdom into a pile of ash. The following weekend, there was an industry event at a rooftop bar in West Hollywood. Jackson and Clarissa were on the guest list, so were Silas and I. I had made sure of it through a few well-placed messages to mutual acquaintances, and by using my own professional connections. I told Silas it was an important networking event for my career, and he agreed to go because he always supported my ambitions. He even bought me a new dress for the occasion, a deep emerald green that made my eyes look like glass. As we drove toward the Sunset Strip, I checked my phone one last time. Jackson had sent a message 30 minutes prior, telling me how much he wanted to see me tonight. He had no idea that he was about to get exactly what he asked for. We arrived as the sun was setting, casting a long and bloody orange light over the city. The rooftop was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and the hum of ambitious people talking over each other. The air was cool, but the tension in my body made me feel like I was burning. I saw them immediately. Jackson and Clarissa were standing near the edge of the pool, the center of a small circle of admirers. He looked exactly like he did in his photos, smug and entirely confident in his own immunity. He was wearing an expensive suit and holding a glass of champagne, acting the part of the perfect Los Angeles gentleman, while Clarissa stood by his side, looking radiant. I felt Silas's hand on the small of my back, and for the first time in a week, I did not feel the urge to pull away. I looked at him, and then I looked at Jackson. The game was about to move from the digital world to the physical one, and I was ready to see the look on Jackson's face when he realized that the girl he thought was an easy target had been the one holding the gun all along. I took a deep breath and began to walk toward them, my heart steady and my mind clear. The revenge was no longer a plan, it was a reality in motion, and I was going to make sure that by the time the night was over, Jackson Thorne would never dare to look at another woman as a prize to be won. I watched the light of the Los Angeles skyline reflect in the eyes of a man who did not realize he was already a ghost. The air on the West Hollywood rooftop was cool and carried the scent of expensive gin and the faint metallic tang of the city below. Silas stood beside me, his presence a constant and steady warmth that I no longer felt I deserved, but was determined to protect. He was looking at the view with a simple and honest appreciation, while across the pool, Jackson Thorne was performing for his audience. Jackson was the architect of his own vanity, leaning into Clarissa as if she were a prop in the movie of his life. I felt the weight of my phone in my clutch purse like a loaded weapon. I had spent the last week gathering every digital sin he had committed, and tonight I was going to broadcast them to the only people whose opinions he feared. We began to move toward them through the press of bodies. Every step felt like a deliberate choice in a game that had no undo button. Silas noticed my focus and asked if I was okay. I told him I was just ready to make an impression. He smiled and squeezed my hand, believing that I was talking about my career. He had no idea that I was talking about an execution. When we reached the inner circle of the group, Jackson looked up and our eyes met. I saw the flicker of recognition in his gaze, followed immediately by a wave of confusion. He recognized my face from the warehouse, but the version of me standing before him now was sharp and polished and wrapped in emerald silk. I was no longer the girl he could easily corner in the dark. I was a peer in a room where reputation was the only currency that mattered. Clarissa was the first to speak. She was every bit as elegant as her photos suggested, with a voice that was practiced and melodic. She introduced herself, and Jackson followed suit, his voice dropping into that familiar, predatory low tone. He introduced himself to Silas with a firm handshake and a smile that was entirely performative. He looked at Silas with a condescending pity, as if he were looking at a man who had won a lottery he didn't deserve to enter. I watched them interact, and the contrast was blinding. Silas was real and solid and kind, while Jackson was a hollow shell held together by expensive tailoring and the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. The conversation turned to the industry and the upcoming projects that everyone was working on. Jackson began to brag about a new branding deal he was closing with a major fashion house. He was the center of attention, and he was loving every second of it. I waited for the perfect moment, for the lull in the conversation that always happens when someone is finished talking about themselves. When that moment came, I pulled out my phone. I told the group that I had actually seen some of Jackson's work recently, and that it was truly impressive in its boldness. I saw Jackson's eyes widen slightly as I spoke. He was trying to figure out if I was the girl from the messages or the girl from the rave, and the uncertainty was starting to eat at his composure. I suggested that we should look at the digital campaign he had been telling me about. There was a large, high-definition screen behind the bar area that was currently cycling through various aesthetic cityscapes. I had already made arrangements with the event coordinator, under the guise of being part of the marketing team for the venue. I told the group that I had a link to the private preview. I sent the file to the lead display, and as the screen flickered, I saw Jackson's face go pale. He realized too late that the link I had sent was not a marketing campaign. It was a curated gallery of his own words and actions. The screen did not show fashion or luxury. It showed a series of high-resolution screenshots of our conversation from the past week. It showed the vulgar things he had said to a stranger. It showed the photos he had sent from his office while Clarissa was sitting at home. It showed the way he spoke about his relationship as a cage and the way he viewed women as targets. The rooftop went silent. The only sound was the low hum of the city and the ice clinking in someone's glass. I watched Clarissa's face as she processed the reality of the man standing next to her. The polish and the grace evaporated, replaced by a cold and devastating realization. Jackson tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the screen and then at me, and the mask of the Los Angeles gentleman finally shattered. He looked small and desperate and pathetic. He looked like the scavenger he had always been. Silas was standing next to me, his eyes moving from the screen to Jackson with a look of profound disappointment. He did not yell and he did not throw a punch. He simply looked at the man who had tried to ruin his life and saw nothing but a shadow. The people around us began to whisper, and the social circle that Jackson had spent years building began to collapse in real time. In this city, you can be many things, but you cannot be a liability to the people who give you status. Clarissa did not scream. She simply took the glass of champagne from Jackson's hand and set it down on a nearby table. She looked him in the eye and told him that he was done. She told him that his office space was in her name and that his car was a gift she was taking back. She walked away without looking back, and the group followed her, leaving Jackson standing alone in the center of the rooftop. He was a man who had everything 10 minutes ago, and now he was a man who had nothing but a digital record of his own cowardice. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and awe, and I simply gave him a small and final nod. As Silas and I walked toward the elevator, I felt the weight of the last week finally lift. The guilt was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet and absolute justice. Silas did not ask how I had gotten those messages or why I had done it. He simply put his arm around me and we descended toward the street. He knew that I had protected him, and he knew that the girl he loved was far more capable than anyone had ever given her credit for. We walked out into the cool night air of the Sunset Strip, and I did not look back. I had learned that loyalty is not just an agreement, it is a fortress, and sometimes you have to burn the world down to keep it standing. The city of Los Angeles continued to glow around us, a landscape of secrets and dreams, but for the first time I felt like I truly belonged. I was not just a background character in someone else's story. I was the one who decided how the ending would be written. We got into the car and drove back towards Silver Lake, leaving the wreckage of Jackson Thorne's life in our rearview mirror. I looked at my hands and saw that they were steady. I had saved my relationship, and I had destroyed a predator, and I did it all without ever raising my voice. That was the real power of the city. It wasn't about who shouted the loudest, but about who held the truth until the moment it mattered most.